Good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. I'm Trevor Phillips. You probably didn't expect to see me sitting in for Sophy this morning, but surprise, surprise, as Cilla Black used to say. And frankly, there could be far bigger shocks before the day is out. Vladimir Putin probably didn't expect to wake up on his birthday weekend to see the bridge he opened to Crimea with a massive hole in it. What are you going to do about it? Liz Truss said she didn't mind being unpopular, but I don't suppose even she expected she'd have to drop one of her Chancellor's headline tax cuts, the abolition of the 45p rate. But it looks like she'll now have to quell a cabinet rebellion over whether benefits rise in line with inflation or earnings. Will she stand firm or buckle? Keir Starmer's probably rubbing his eyes in disbelief at an average poll lead of over 25%. That would hand him a stonking majority in a general election. But could the SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, put a spanner in the works on that one? Well, like all political journalists, I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't, but in the next 60 minutes, we'll do the next best thing, which is talk to the people who have to answer those questions. In a moment, I'll be joined by one of the most senior cabinet members, Cabinet Office Minister Nadhim Zahawi. Plus, for Labour, the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. And just days before the SNP takes its case for a second Scottish referendum to the Supreme Court, we'll be speaking to the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, the SNP's Angus Robertson. The railways are getting back to normal this morning, but nurses are now balloting for strike action. I'll be speaking to the RCN General Secretary and Chief Executive, that's Pat Cullen. And as supermarkets offer £1 hot meals and warm spaces to help people cope with rising energy bills, the former Sainsbury Chief Executive, Justin King, joins us. And joining me now is the Cabinet Office Minister, Nadhim Zahawi. Good morning.
Good morning.
Minister. Now, you've written a newspaper article this morning calling on Conservative MPs to rally round Liz Truss. Did you expect that you'd have to be, within a month of her election, you'd have to be begging your colleagues to give her a break?
So I wrote the article because I think delay is our biggest enemy. We've got 2 years to demonstrate to the nation that we can deliver the growth plan, deliver the energy strategy that weans us off expensive oil and gas being imported to the United Kingdom by investing in nuclear, investing in offshore wind, onshore wind, and of course other renewables. And I want my colleagues to obviously focus because any dither or delay will end in defeat. And that's what we don't want to see. We want to be able to demonstrate to the nation, as we have done. First couple of days in office, Liz Truss put on, and I was Chancellor of the Exchequer who developed the plans, the biggest energy package to protect households and businesses probably in history. Is an enormous intervention to make sure that households can feel safe at Christmas, that they'll have the ability to keep the heating on, whilst Putin, you mentioned Putin in your opening remarks, is using energy as a weapon against us because of the help we're putting into Ukraine and to get Ukraine their country back.
So I understand that, but the thing that you really most apparently, I read the article, want to delay is Tory MPs criticising the Prime Minister. Did you expect that you'd have to do that?
Well, I want to see unity. I want us to, now that we've had a leadership election, we've got a Prime Minister in place, we've got 24 months to deliver. The Cabinet Office is effectively, I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the government, the COO. My responsibility, Liz has given us the priorities for each department. So let me bring that to life for you. In health, it's about A, B, C, D. So ambulance, the backlog, care, then GPs and dentists, doctors and dentists. If we deliver that in the next 2 years, where people feel confident they'll get their GP appointment within 2 weeks, hopefully even earlier, they'll get a dentist appointment on the NHS, that we will actually finally deliver a care system that is fit for purpose, that people can see and feel the difference, then we will absolutely, I think, be confident in going to the country and saying, give us another term.
I want to give you a chance to talk about policy in a second, but let's just deal with the politics. You're not the only ones taken to newspapers this morning. Penny Mordaunt and Suella Braverman, your cabinet colleagues, have written similar pieces. Could this be the same Penny Mordaunt who was the first to publicly disagree with the policy of let's wait and see on inflation or earnings benefits? Or could it be the same Suella Braverman who told a fringe meeting, second day of your conference, that she thought the U-turn on 45p was disappointing? I have to say, isn't this a bit like the arsonists turning up to a house fire with a bucket saying, oh, we want to help? They're the ones who started this.
Well, first of all, you will know, Trevor, because you're a veteran of party conferences. Party conferences...
That's a way of telling me I'm old. No. That's not going to put me off. They were the two people who started this.
Well, first of all, as I said, we'd been in office under Liz Truss for a very short period of time when Her late Majesty sadly passed away, and then we had to obviously coordinate, and it was the honour of my life to coordinate the funeral and commemoration for Her Majesty. And of course, we have cabinet collective responsibility, but we've literally had, I think, only one cabinet meeting. That hasn't stopped us doing the work. I have, as in my role as Chief Operating Officer, been making sure all those targets are now unpacked. There's targets by time and, of course, by milestone in place for each of those
Minister,
departments.
you're not dealing with this point,
I'm coming to
which is about your colleagues who were the first to criticise the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in various ways, suddenly deciding that they're calling for unity. I mean, for goodness sake.
Well, so let's
Can't be serious.
No, it is very serious, because actually both Penny and Suella are part of that team, part of that cabinet. We've got cabinet collective responsibility. On the universal credit uplift, the Secretary of State at the Department for Work and Pensions, Chloe Smith, there's a process, you know that. There's a process. The actual data from September is still not fully collated. The one thing I would tell your viewers is Liz Truss will always be on the side of helping the most vulnerable. The 8 million most vulnerable households are not only getting the advantage of the energy price cap, she's put in the average household not paying more than £2,500 for their energy, but also the £1,200 that we previously got in place that we're getting to those households. So we'll always be on the side of those households that need the most help. But until we have the process complete at DWP, no decision has been made on the universal credit, on the benefits operating.
But if I may say so, this is unusual for you. You're still not answering my question. The two cabinet ministers who have written these articles knew all that you've just said when they went out at the Conservative Party conference and said, oh no, we're not going to stick to the line and wait until the Chancellor's decided on this benefits thing. Penny Mordaunt said, I'm for inflation, when she knew that the cabinet line was not to say anything. Suella Braverman, day after a U-turn, says, actually, don't think that was right. And they're now saying, calling for unity. This doesn't make any sense.
When you are moving at pace and delay is your enemy, we have little time. We've got 24 months to demonstrate to the nation that we can deliver this growth plan, we can deliver the energy plan, we can deliver the infrastructure, the health care plan, all these things. We're moving incredibly fast. If Penny was here, or Suella, as I say to you, of course we take cabinet collective responsibility. On Suella's point, what she was saying is this Prime Minister is focused on tax receipts coming into the Exchequer to pay for the doctors and nurses and teachers and police officers that we want to see actually delivering for this country.
All right.
That is perfectly sensible, but we have cabinet collective responsibility, and when we make a decision on the universal credit, on the benefits uplift,
everybody will
then we will row behind.
All right, let's talk about policy. The Prime Minister introduced a new phrase to us last week, the anti-growth coalition. Now, I suppose that includes people who don't want building on green belt, people who don't want fracking, people who like their villages just as they are and don't want new housing estates at the bottom of the garden, and people who think that we've had far too much immigration and we shouldn't be doing any more of that. Those sound to me like solid Tory voters. So isn't your strategy self-destructive?
You are mischievously conflating consent of the people versus actual policy on delivery of a dynamic economy. Why do I say that? So let's take the issue of immigration. People absolutely right that we want to bear down on bad migration. So if you look at, say, let me give you an example, on international students. International students are a plus, a really positive thing for our universities, for our communities. But if you look at the number of dependents that come with international students, you'd expect most international students may bring one dependent, or if they are doing a PhD, they might bring their wife and maybe a child or two. There are some people who are coming to study in the UK who are bringing 5, 6 more people with them. Is that right? No, because we have to make sure that they're coming to legitimately study here. And of course, that is the right thing to do, to look at bearing down on abuse of the system. On the other side of that equation, on the projects that we're trying to deliver. So let's look at gigabit broadband. We need more engineers who can splice the actual technology together to deliver gigabit broadband. If we need another 200 or 300 engineers to come in to be able to do that at pace, I think people will support that. If you look at what we're doing on, what we're doing on investment zones. Investment zones are about local areas consenting to having an investment zone that includes substantial amounts of residential building, of commercial building. That's a good thing. On gas, on tapping into our gas assets.
OK, just before you go on to that,
right?
This is a great picture you're painting. Yeah. When you say people who will support that, I take one person who's not going to support it, Suella Braverman, who last week said we want to get immigration down to below net 100,000. Right now, it's net 239,000. She is one person who is not going to agree with the words you've just said, so honestly.
I'll answer that in a very straightforward way, because I have a weekly meeting, because I chair that meeting, on both legal migration and, of course, the illegal migration that we want to stamp out, including the issue around small boats where people are being, having their lives put in danger by these gangs, and we want to break that business model with Suella Braverman in those weekly meetings, because, again, remember what I said to you at the beginning? Time is against us. Delay is our enemy. We have to move at pace to deliver this stuff. As the Chief Operating Officer, I do that. Suella's in those meetings every week, and she would agree with me when I say to you, we have to bear down on the bad migration and make sure that the economy and the big projects I want to deliver, the needs of those projects are met at speed in the next 24 months, because what Liz wants to see is not just announcements, but delivery. She wants to see outputs.
When we next see her, we'll ask her if she really agrees. But let's not delay, and let's get to the thing that I think most people will be having on their minds right now. Winter's coming. Energy is an issue. The National Grid says that, though it's unlikely, there could be planned blackouts. Do you agree with that?
It's extremely unlikely. So let me, again, Cabinet Office and my responsibility is to chair those meetings. We've got a couple of things that are things that we've done that help us deal with winter, and of course, war on our continent is the cause of us being very focused on making sure we have the resilience in place over winter. What have we got? We've got the second largest LNG processing infrastructure in Europe.
Yeah.
Half of our gas we produce here at home. We want to go further. This year we've increased our output by 26% on gas. We've got interconnectors with our neighbours. Now, what the National Grid is saying is the extremely unlikely scenario where there's issues in Europe with the interconnectors.
And a cold snap.
And a very cold snap.
But it's possible, isn't it?
So it is extremely unlikely, but it's only right that we plan for every scenario. But all I would say is we have a buffer, the same buffer as last year. And so I'm confident that come Christmas, come the cold weather, We will continue to be in that resilient place. But it's only right that we have we have actually looked at every scenario.
Okay.
Now, what the National Grid is doing with Ofgem is also actually having a communication program to tell people how they can do better. We ourselves, if you go on gov.uk, you will be able to see how you can actually, help
this is interesting.
Your home or your business conserve energy. Because
this is very interesting. So the stories we've been hearing about the government saying to Jacob Rees-Mogg's department, that plan that you've got for telling people how they can dial down the amount of energy that they use and so on, there will now be a government campaign and government, not direction, but government information about how we can all use less energy.
So the question you ask is about spending £14 million on a campaign. That, I think, is the wrong thing, because actually, if you go on gov.uk now, you will see, if you search what tips there are for you to be able to conserve more energy, use energy wisely. The National Grid and Ofgem, and actually a number of the energy providers, are using the direct communication with households to be able to say, here are some measures that you can take.
So is it going to tell us things like how we turn down the boiler temperature? Is it going to tell us to do laundry at night?
What we're not doing is spending £14 million on a government campaign.
Yeah, OK, you don't have to spend money. But, well, let me ask you. You're the Minister for sorting stuff out, really, at the moment. If I say to you, what should I be doing? Should I be doing my laundry at night? Should I, the Norwegians are telling people, shower with a friend? Is that what you're going to be recommending?
So I think, look, the really positive thing that Liz Truss has done, if you think through what she did in the first 2 days, is having the energy price cap where the average household will not pay more than £2,500, has two positive things. One,
everybody agrees about this.
Right.
Everybody agrees about it. We haven't got all day. I just want to ask you,
it helps
will
households.
You be giving people advice about things they ought to do to reduce the amount of energy they personally use and we collectively use?
So if they go on gov.uk, there's lots of advice on that. And National Grid,
a specific campaign?
Ofgem, no, not a specific campaign. But actually, the bearing down on the cost of energy for households help people cope with war on our continent and make sure they have a safe Christmas when it comes to their energy consumption. By the way, it does one other thing, which we haven't talked about. It actually bears down on inflation, up to 5% on inflation. Yep. And that fiscal responsibility will help then the monetary policy, that is the Independent Bank of England, hopefully bring inflation back under control as well.
We are seeing this morning images of at least one half of a bridge between Russia and Crimea in the water. And as you've already suggested, that is part of the problem that we're facing to do with energy and food shortages potentially and so on. Is this a turning point in that war, do you think?
So when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer, I worked with Janet Yellen, my opposite number, in the United States to get the political agreement at G7 on the oil price cap so that we don't allow Putin to profiteer from excessively high prices of oil. I think Mr. Putin needs to end this war. And the way you end this war is by actually pulling your troops from all of the Ukraine as quickly as possible. We will continue to support the Ukrainians in their incredible endeavour to get their country back. Ben Wallace spoke about this at party conference. The work that he is doing, that James Cleverly's doing at the Department in Development and, of course, aid that's going into Ukraine, it will continue. And I think there's one way to stop this war. The only way to stop this war is for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine.
Well, that's not necessarily the case. Mr. Putin thinks we understand that there may be another way to stop this war, which is the use of nuclear weapons. And Mr. Biden has said that they think that's a realistic prospect. Mr. Zelensky has said he thinks that's a realistic prospect. Does the British government think that it's a realistic prospect that Putin could use nuclear weapons?
Well, Putin is unpredictable, and I will not wish to speculate as to what he does next. The right thing to do is to withdraw. I think the Russian people will have something to say if he decides to give the order to use nuclear weapons on people that he claims to be his cousins and
Yeah, they haven't had much
family.
of a say so far, have they? I mean,
Well,
but the main point I really want to ask you is, a year ago, we didn't take what he said seriously. And we were surprised, frankly, by February 24th.
It's quite the opposite. If you remember, Trevor, we were actually front-running that story, which irritated him. We, with our allies, the Americans, we were telling the world that Putin will invade. He's preparing for invasion, full-scale invasion, when actually few people in other parts of the world agreed with us. So I think it was the opposite.
I won't argue the toss with you about that, but if we are so... if we know it all, what do we actually believe he is likely to do now? Will he or will he not, according to the briefings and the advice that you have, be prepared to use nuclear weapons?
We don't know it all. We have to continue to support the Ukrainians. And, of course, they have to be the ones in the lead on this. They're the ones who are fighting for their freedom, fighting for our freedom. If you go back a step, Trevor, because this is important to you.
Brief.
You remember what Putin did with Assad in Syria, where there was that red line about using chemical weapons, and we never actually followed through, because actually it was Ed Miliband at the time, who was leader of the Labour Party, he withdrew support to Cameron on that. He then took the Crimea, and there was very little impact. Now, it is very different. Now, Europe, the world's united in many ways, the free world's united in supporting Ukraine to claim their freedom and our freedom and safety back.
Nadhim Zahawi, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Now, if these are difficult times for the new government, then Labour might feel they're hitting new heights. Some opinion polls are giving them a 30-point lead over the Conservatives. An election has to be called in the next 2 years. So how is the party going to win back power? And while they might criticise the government, undoubtedly will, they must now convince voters that they can solve the cost of living crisis. To see what they're going to do, I'm joined by the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. Good morning. Good morning. Can I just pick up what Nadhim Zahawi's just been saying? What is Labour's view about Putin's intentions? We can't know. He's right to say that Putin is unpredictable. But do you think we need to be prepared for the possibility that he could use nuclear weapons?
Well, of course, we have to be prepared for all eventualities. I'm not going to speculate on the mind of Putin. I'm not remotely in a position to do so. But clearly, we need to continue to support Ukraine in every way that we can. We need to work internationally to ensure that pressure is continually applied to Putin. And of course, yes, we have to be prepared. But look, I've read experts suggest that this may be a bluff. I mean, it's pretty serious. I'm not downplaying it remotely. But look, it's not for me to speculate on the psychology of Putin and what he may or may not do. But obviously, we need to be prepared.
All right, let's deal with psychology closer to home. I know you study. Labour has said that it would not have proposed the abolition of the 45p rate. Labour has said that it will keep the 1p off income tax if it comes to power. It will also keep the cap on energy bills and spend £2 billion on NHS staff. You also support the investments proposed by the Tories in skills on what they call supply side. Other than the windfall tax, what concrete measures would a Labour government take to deal with the economic situation that the Conservatives have not taken?
Well, the economic situation is perilous at the moment because that budget 3 weeks ago or so wasn't just a budget which gave £45 billion worth of unfunded tax cuts disproportionately to the better off in society. Because there was no validation of the plans of that budget by the independent OBR, it led to turmoil on the markets, it led to gilt yields rising, it led to a run on pension funds, and now mortgage costs are soaring. So people coming off a mortgage, and this year about 1.8 million of them will be doing that in the next 12 months or so, are facing a mortgage increase of hundreds of pounds every month as a consequence. So we are in a particular perilous moment because of decisions that were taken by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng 3 weeks ago. It's why we've called for that kamikaze budget to be reversed because we need to build a dynamic economy, absolutely, but we need stability in our economy. Instead, what we've got is a reckless approach, a spike in borrowing costs, and now the government, as we understand it, are talking about asking working mums and dads, disabled people, poorer pensioners, to pay the price for that recklessness.
If I may say so, Sky viewers know all of that because we're reporting it all the time. What Sky viewers have no idea about is what you would do. So let me ask you again. What would Labour do, other than the windfall tax, which would only last a year, what would Labour do to tackle all of the problems you've enumerated that the Conservatives are not now doing?
Well, actually, at our party conference just 2 weeks ago, we outlined how we're going to rebuild our economy, make our economy more dynamic and spread prosperity and opportunity. For example, we're going to invest in the green technologies of the future, not only because...
So are they?
No, well, they're not. The problem is they're not, are they? If they were...
They are.
No, they're not. No, they're not. No, they're not. No, they're not.
They've given you the numbers that they're going to invest.
No, they haven't. No, they haven't.
And it runs into billions.
No, they haven't. They've degraded our gas storage facilities. They've criticised solar panels in fields. I mean, I remember they're refusing to go for onshore wind, so they're not investing in the green technology of the future.
They're not refusing to go for offshore wind.
Onshore wind.
They haven't made a decision on that.
No, come on.
But anyway,
No.
Okay, I'll tell you,
You're asking me a question.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you another 30 seconds.
No,
and say
I'm answering your
everything you'd like to say about the Tories, and then let's come back to Labour. 30 seconds to tell us how bad the Tories are.
I'm not talking about the Tories. I'm talking about what Labour are doing. We're going to invest in these green technologies, not only because in this period of international instability...
How much are you going to invest?
£28 billion.
OK. Rachel Reeves told us that. She told me that, actually, about 6 months ago. OK, so what's new? About the cost of living, about inflation. We're now in a different situation. You yourself have just said that. What would you do about this situation that Tories don't do?
I tell you what we will do. We're going to reform our welfare system to get people back to work. The 600,000 over 50s have left the labour market since the pandemic. Those leaving the labour market for reasons of sickness is now rising at its highest rate ever and is at a 20-year high. And yet we don't have a Job Centre Plus system or a welfare system that is supporting these people to go back into work. Many of them say they will return to work if they're given the correct support to do it. And yet the government are not giving those people any support whatsoever. Now, if you can get people back to work, that is a supply-side reform which helps...
What does that support look like? What is it? Is it money? Is it advice? What is it?
Well, some of it is to do with advice and employment services. So, for example, if you're in your 50s and you've left the labour market, it may be that you are looking for a flexible type of work. It may be that you're caring for grandchildren, but also caring for a loved one, a mum or a dad or a partner who might have dementia or might have had a stroke, and you're looking for a flexible work option. At the moment, you can't walk into the job centre and ask for help to find that job for you. So I want to reform the way job centres work. I want to reform the way in which we do employment services in this country to get more people into work. And those who are currently on benefits in low-paid work, I want to give them the help so they can work more hours or move into better-paid jobs. So actually, we've got a big programme of reform to our social security system, which will help more people into work, which is the type of supply-side reform that will actually bring inflation down, stabilise the cost of living and grow our economy.
All right, look, I mean, we could carry on about that. I'm not sure I can still quite see the difference here, but let's talk about...
Well, there's a big difference because the Conservative government aren't doing that.
OK.
And there's a million vacancies in the economy.
All I can tell you is that they will sit here and tell me that they are doing it, but
they won't. I promise you they won't. I absolutely promise you that they won't.
I've heard it. They said it. Anyway, let's talk about something that matters today, and that is the SNP have their conference. We are pretty sure that they will call for a second independent referendum. If Labour were in government, would it grant the SNP a second referendum?
No.
OK. The Scottish government, let me ask you another thing, because it is thought unlikely that Labour will get an outright majority. They're looking at the polls today, that's possible. But let's say that the most likely outcome here is that Labour would need some support from the SNP. What are your relations like right now on issues like, for example, the gender recognition question? The Scottish National Party says that it plans to make it legal for an individual born with a typical male body to have their gender changed without any professional assessment or medical intervention. That's what they want to do. Will Labour support that bill?
Well, hang on. The whole premise of your question was that Labour cannot form a majority. Now, I'm not one to pray in opinion polls, because I believe the only opinion polls that matter is the one on election day.
You've told me that before, yes.
On election day. But I'm afraid the premise of your question is that Labour won't get a majority. Well, the opinion polls are not showing that at the moment, as indeed you did concede when you asked me the question.
I've acknowledged that.
So, look, right, we are campaigning for, and we are hoping to win the trust of the British people to form a majority Labour government. So whatever the SNP policy is here or there or everywhere is irrelevant. We're going to form a majority Labour government in order to rebuild our public services, in order to get people back to work and actually to support people through this cost of living crisis.
Just to come back to my specific question, will the Labour Party in the Scottish Parliament vote for this piece of legislation?
I mean, I presume I don't know is the honest answer, but I presume my colleagues in the Scottish Labour Party are broadly supportive of changes to support trans people who are a very marginalised group in society, a very stigmatised group in society, and have often treated appallingly.
But including male-bodied people going into women's refuges, for example? And women's prisons?
Well, is that a specific
That's what that
item
legislation would allow.
Well, look, my colleagues in the Scottish Labour Party in the Parliament will no doubt have opinions on this and will respond. I mean, I'm not a member of the Scottish Parliament.
All right, John Ashworth, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank
you. Now, this week, the Supreme Court will hear one of the biggest and most sensitive constitutional arguments. Should Scotland be allowed to hold a second independence referendum? The current rules mean it can only take place if the UK government agrees to a vote, as I've just been talking to Jonathan Ashworth about. The SNP government in Holyrood argues that having won last year's Scottish parliamentary election, they have the right to call another ballot. Well, the opinion polls on the question of Scottish independence remain very finely balanced. So with the cost of living crisis, can the SNP persuade Scots to their cause? We're joined by Angus Robertson from the SNP, Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, External Affairs and Culture in Scotland. Good morning, Mr Robertson.
Morning, Trevor.
Thank you for joining us. Now, Nicola Sturgeon's complained this week that Liz Truss hasn't been in touch. Is that still true?
I believe so, yeah.
And just as a matter of interest, why doesn't she just pick up the phone and call Liz Truss?
Well, I think the First Minister did speak in passing to Liz Truss at the funeral for Her Majesty the Queen, but it's common custom and practice when somebody takes up office. This is what happened with both Boris Johnson and his predecessor, that they got in touch with the First Ministers of both Scotland and Wales on assuming office within days of doing so. That's what happened then. That's not what's happening now, and it's disappointing and frankly a bit childish.
Well, yeah, but, you know, Nicola Sturgeon's been there a lot longer than Liz Truss. Wouldn't it be a bit grown up for her to... She knows Liz Truss. Just ring up and say, when are we going to have a chat?
I just told you that she did speak to her. What it is at issue is that the Prime Minister, who, if you remember, made great play of suggesting that she would ignore the First Minister of Scotland, is ignoring the First Minister of Scotland, is ignoring the First Minister of Wales, and that's not how it's supposed to work. In a devolved UK, a multinational state, we're supposed to have grown-up relations, which is exactly why the First Minister did speak to the new Prime Minister at the Queen's funeral. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister hasn't found time yet to speak to the First Ministers of Scotland or Wales since assuming office. Had time to speak to a lot of other people.
Oh, OK. This is, forgive me, this might be a little confusing for viewers. She has spoken to her or she has not spoken to her? Have they spoken or have they not?
Spoken to The First Minister of Scotland spoke in passing to the Prime Minister at the funeral of Her Majesty the Queen. That's what I said a moment ago. What's normal when a Prime Minister takes office is that they call the leaders of governments and countries with whom they have a valued relationship. That's the normal custom and practice, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has not seen fit to speak to the First Ministers of Scotland or Wales at any great length since taking office, which is odd, given that a unionist politician who says that there's a respect agenda between the UK government and the different nations of the United Kingdom doesn't think that it's worth speaking to the leaders of Scotland or Wales.
OK, I understand. The point is that Ms Sturgeon feels she hasn't been spoken to at the right time and with sufficient respect and at same length. Now, one of the things that they could have talked about then would have been the state of the economy and what you do about it together. Can you just make clear, what is the Scottish Government's point of view on the basic rate of income tax? Will it be agreeing with the UK Government that the basic rate should come down to 19p, which is in the Scottish Government's purview? It can decide whether it goes with it or doesn't. What are you going to do?
So the first thing that the Scottish Government would do is tell the UK Government that it has made a huge mistake with its approach to the UK economy, crashing the currency, driving debt through the roof, leading to uncertainty in the markets that is driving mortgage rates up, which will make mortgage payments for far too many people the length and breadth of the UK unaffordable. So launching a kamikaze budget at the beginning of a term of office is certainly not something that the SNP would be supporting. And from the start, we have said that, especially in relation to the tax cuts to the rich, whether it's the 45p rate or whether it's the bankers' bonuses, that's exactly the wrong way to go. In terms of other tax changes, Deputy First Minister John Swinney has called together experts who will be advising him with a report before the end of this month when we have to make decisions about what we will be doing with tax rates in Scotland. You're absolutely right to highlight that we do have marginal controls over taxation in Scotland, and at that point the right decisions would be made. But we would certainly not have been emulating the very damaging approach that the UK Tory government has been making towards the economy in Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Oh, so if your view is that you do not want to copy what the Truss government is doing, it is quite possible that come April, Scots will be paying more in income tax than everybody else in the UK.
I'm sure you'd want to finish off that sentence by pointing out the fact to viewers in the rest of the UK that taxpayers in Scotland in general, the majority pay less tax across the piece than the rest of the United Kingdom. Those are the facts as they stand. We are trying to find the appropriate balance in government policy to make sure
Let's not confuse the total tax take.
Sorry, I didn't...
OK, let me
Sorry, Trevor,
question.
you didn't clarify.
You've responded on the total tax take. The question I asked was that the individual taxpayer in Scotland would be paying a higher basic rate than others in the UK.
And as I said, and I'm not incorrect to point this out, the majority of taxpayers in Scotland pay less tax than the rest of the United Kingdom. That is the context at the present time. I also said just a moment ago that Deputy First Minister John Swinney, who's in charge of the public finances at this present time in Scotland, is reviewing the impact of the UK government's mini-budget to work out what the appropriate decisions should be in Scotland, and will be doing it on the basis of the facts, unlike the UK government that has been making very damaging decisions without the advice of the Office of Budget Responsibility. We are going to make decisions about Scotland's finances in a prudent way, but there's a wider point at issue with this, Trevor, which is Scotland doesn't need to be in this situation. We don't need to have our public finances decided upon by people that we have not elected since 1955. We, of course, have another option, and we voted in favour of that in last year's Scottish Parliament election, namely to have a referendum referendum in this country so that we can become an independent state and rejoin the European Union. I would far rather not be at the mercy of Tory Chancellors of the Exchequer or Prime Ministers who we haven't voted for. It's not sustainable. And it's not sensible, given everything that we've learned about their financial imprudence and their belief in a Thatcherite economic orthodoxy, which is going to cost us all dearly.
All right, let's move away from the things that, for which, as you would put it, the Tories are responsible, and let's talk about the things which you do all by yourself. So, for example, there's supposed to be an inquiry into COVID in Scotland. Can you tell us when that's going to start? And by the way, can you tell us why the chair and I think four councils have resigned from that inquiry?
So in Scotland, we have a separation of powers. Government is separate from the legal system, so it's not for me to speak on behalf of Scottish judges or Scottish advocates about an inquiry that is separate from government. You'll have to arrange to speak to people in Scotland's legal system for those kind of questions. We value the separation of government and our judicial system, and it's going to remain that way.
Professor Peter Watson, who represents the families of those who lost loved ones, says this inquiry is going nowhere. It's commissioned by the Scottish Government. Surely you do have some responsibility for it.
Well, I would wish it could be underway, and I would wish that it would report as quickly as possible. The lessons need to be learned, and as you quite rightly say, families want answers. They deserve that. But I'm pointing out a basic fact about the way government and the way our judicial system works in this country. It's not for us to intervene in personnel decisions about independent legal inquiries. Of course, I hope that it is up and running as quickly as possible. I hope that it can conclude as quickly as possible. And it's a shame that things are not underway. Those questions, though, are rightly to be addressed at our legal authorities, who are very separate from government, and quite rightly so. And in the meantime, if there's any way that government can help, whilst protecting the independence of our legal system, to get on with the inquiry that we would all want to see conclude, we would be happy to do that.
All right, well, let's try and talk about something for which you and only you are responsible, which is what you say about IndyRef 2. The First Minister said this week that if you don't get a favourable judgment from the Supreme Court, that you will treat the general election as a vote on independence. Now, some people might say that's just a tad arrogant. Isn't it for the voters to decide what a general election is about?
Well, let's just remind ourselves what the voters actually decided. And we had an election last year where this was the #1 issue in the election. People voted, and they voted in record numbers for a pro-independence government in the Scottish Parliament. The parties that were elected on a manifesto commitment that the people should be able to decide in the referendum won the election, and the parties that opposed that, the Conservatives, the Labour Party, and the Liberal Democrats, lost. No, it's a very with greatest Trevor.
You weren't in the voting booth
with the greatest of respect.
How do you know that that was the #1 issue for them?
With the greatest, well, I was in the middle of the election campaign. I had the good fortune to win the seat that Ruth Davidson previously held as the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party in Edinburgh Central. I know very well why I won that election. I know what was in my manifesto, and the people knew what was in the SNP manifesto. I'm not going to patronise the electorate. The electorate voted for a pro-independence majority in the Parliament, and to simply do as if that doesn't matter, frankly, is not good enough in a democracy. And when you have guests on programmes and ask them whether they will respect democratic election results, to simply pass on from it when they say, no, we're not going to respect a democracy, is frankly slightly odd in my view. It is remarkable how UK political parties that lost the election in Scotland in this issue are given a pass on this. Either we we live in a democracy or we don't. The people have voted to have the right to choose. And in a democracy, the people should be able to choose. They can vote yes, they can vote no, but surely they should have the right to choose. We can solve this issue very simply because we managed to do it in the run-up to 2014. The UK government respected the election result in Scotland. They passed what was called a Section 30 order, and we were able to hold a referendum in Scotland. There is no impediment to this happening. The fact that we've had to go to the Supreme Court, the fact that we're having to invoke the possibility of using elections to yet again show that people want to choose on this country's future is not where we need to be. I'd far rather the UK government just respected the Scottish electorate, respected the election result in the majority of the Scottish Parliament, and as good Democrats, abide by democratic standards. Unfortunately, the Conservatives, and now sadly also the Labour Party, are perfectly happy to discard Scottish democracy, and it's not good enough.
OK. Angus Robertson, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Now, train services across the country are returning to normal this morning, but already other key workers are threatening widespread strike action. The Royal College of Nursing has sent ballot papers to 300,000 members across the UK, the largest vote it's ever called. The college says that nurses are understaffed, undervalued and underpaid. With us this morning is Pat Cullen, the RCN's General Secretary and Chief Executive. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Before we talk about the strike, where have you actually got to in the negotiations?
Well, put simply, we aren't in negotiations. I have made many attempts on behalf of not just the 300,000 nurses that have been balloted, but the 500,000 plus nurses that I represent. And unfortunately, this government hasn't engaged with the Royal College of Nursing as yet. When
you say they haven't engaged, and do you mean that you've asked for a meeting and whoever happened to be Health Secretary at the time said, no, I'm not talking to you?
Well, the last Health Secretary that I'd contact with was Sajid Javid. And since then, we have made multiple attempts to try and engage with the Health Secretary. The two, the current one and the previous one that was very short-lived. And both of those people have not, as yet, met with the Royal College of Nursing.
But presumably, the actual employer here, anyway, is not Therese Coffey, who's now the Health Secretary, but the NHS. Presumably you are talking to NHS managers.
Of course we're talking to them.
And where have you got to with them?
Well, of course, the NHS managers will say very clearly to me that it's not within their gift to negotiate with me on pay for their employees, which are our nurses. So I'm bounced back to government. And that's right. That's absolutely right. Those employers do not have the authority to actually negotiate, because Agenda for Change sits at, which is the pay framework for our nursing staff, sits within the domain of government to make those decisions.
What is it that you want? What is your sort of central demand?
Well, first of all, for nurses to be paid a fair and decent wage. That's what we're asking for. And our ask is 5% above the rate of inflation. That's very clear. It's not about nurses being greedy. It's not about wanting the same preferential treatment that was given to the bankers and others by this government. We're asking for them to be paid a fair and decent wage so that we can retain them in the health service looking after our patients.
Well, let's leave the bankers aside, because they're not paid by the government. They're not paid by the taxpayer. 5% above inflation this morning is 14.9%. That's quite a hefty rise.
Well, Trevor, you did mention the bankers, but if you looked, and of course we attended the Conservative Party conference and we listened very carefully to what they say, and it does seem that those people, like bankers and others, are very carefully looked after. What we have seen very clearly from this government is that they haven't managed to actually recognise that they cannot have a health service without nurses. We heard this morning from ministers coming on this programme and talking about how they're going to deliver on their A's, their B's, their C's and their D's. And what I want to say to each and every one of them, they'll deliver on none of those if they do not understand there's an N in the alphabet, because each one of those depend on nurses. We deliver nothing in health and social care without having a nurse, and yet they have just seemed to not understand that they need to understand that there's an N in the alphabet, and they need to respect nurses if they want to retain them in the health service. If we can stop our nurses having to leave the health service and indeed social care to find jobs in supermarkets, in restaurants and other places so that they can pay their bills, I think that's an incredible indictment on any minister to sit here and not actually recognise what they are doing to the health service and to patients.
Are you getting any more mileage, if I can put it that way, from the devolved administrations? Scotland is a separate negotiation, I guess, as it would be Northern Ireland.
Well, certainly in Scotland there was a higher percentage pay award granted this time around. It certainly didn't come anywhere near what nurses require in order to make a decent living. They're not asking for, as I've said, golden handshakes out of this. They're not. They're asking for a decent living wage. They're not getting that. So no government, and of course we know the situation in Northern Ireland, so we'll not go there. But as yet, none of the devolved administrations have come up to the standard that we expect them to for our nursing staff.
So you'll be going back to the Scots and Stormont when there is a government in Stormont,
when there is such a thing.
And saying that nurses need a bit more.
We've already done that, yes. And of course, in those 300,000 ballot papers that went out, they went out right across the UK, not just in England.
Well, let's talk about what that means. We don't have any experience of a nurses' strike. How would that work? I mean, if you walk out, what happens to patients who are in intensive care, patients who are going to be dehydrated, patients who need their dressings changed?
OK. Well, actually, we do have experience of a nurses' strike. And I had the privilege, but actually the sadness of leading the first nurses' strike in the 103 years history of this college in late 2019, 2020 in Northern Ireland, when we actually had no government. And during that time, what I would say to each person and member of the public listening this morning, our nursing staff, and I am a nurse of 42 years, will never walk away from you. And during that strike in Northern Ireland, we did not walk out on our patients. We made sure our patients were still cared for. Now, of course, there will be disruption because the clue's in the title. It is about withdrawal of labour. But we still continue to provide life-preserving services during that time. And there are certain services that we will absolutely never withdraw labour from.
But what action would you say? Because in a way, if I may put it this way, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that we are going to hold the government's feet to the fire, but actually, if it becomes difficult for anybody, we're going to look after them.
Well, there's life-preserving services that we will always continue to provide because we are a regulated profession. We will absolutely not just down tools and leave our patients and abandon them. We haven't done it to date and we'll not do it now. We certainly will not. But there will be a withdrawal of nursing staff, and we have very clear clinical protocols in place about how we manage that on a day of a strike, about the number of staff that will remain to provide services for our patients and those that will then, obviously, that you will see, should the time come, that will be seen on picket lines, and that will be managed very carefully and very safely. And the other thing that I will say, that during the strike in Northern Ireland, which lasted for 8 days, and again, if our nurses ballot for strike action in any of our UK countries as we move forward in November, we will cause no further or additional risk to patients that's already created as a consequence of this government turning their back on nursing as we stand.
Well, if I may, can I be specific about it? Will midwives, for example, be involved in this action?
In Northern Ireland, we certainly didn't withdraw midwives at the time of our strike action. No, we didn't.
Indeed, nurses? With ambulances waiting 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8?
And yes, and I go back to the point that I made in the A, the B, the C and the D. None of those will be delivered. Absolutely not. And why do we see those ambulances queued up at the minute? We see them queued up because there's not the nursing staff to look after those patients that are in the backs of those ambulances. And what an indictment on a society to actually keep patients, our elderly patients, in the backs of ambulances simply because we have turned our back on nursing staff.
And finally, if I may ask briefly, what will you do if the government says we're going to treat nurses like police officers and make it unlawful for them to strike?
Well, we heard a lot this morning about democracy, didn't we? And this is the democratic right of the worker to actually, first of all, belong to a trade union and then have representation. And why are we representing our nurses? Because there's no government speaking up for them at the minute. And again, that would be another nail in the coffin for this government to say that they're actually going to silence the workers, the people at the front line, the clinical staff looking after patients day and daily. So I think that would be a very sad day if we move to that position. And certainly our Royal College of Nursing will have something to say about it.
Pat Cullen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, some of Britain's leading supermarkets are stepping in to help staff and customers cope with the cost of living crisis. Sainsbury's offering its staff extra pay rises and free food. Asda's gone even further, selling anyone over 60 a bowl of soup, a roll and unlimited tea and coffee for just £1 in its cafes in November and December. I'm ready. So, are supermarkets the right people to help the poorest in society cope this winter? We're joined by the former Chief Executive of Sainsbury's, Justin King. Good morning, Justin.
Good morning, Trevor, and I'm one of those over 60s too, so it's...
I'll see you down there. Look, we're seeing supermarkets taking these actions, special deals explicitly aimed at people, to help people in tough economic circumstances. One, Asda, I think it is providing warm spaces for people. Do you support all of that?
Well, I've worked for Asda, Sainsbury's. I'm a director of Marks and Spencer's now, and it's been my working life. So, yes, I do. I think supermarkets have always taken very seriously the role that they play in helping their customers, if you like, make ends meet. And the challenge hasn't been as great as this until, since you and I were a lot younger. I can remember the 1970s, which is probably the last time the challenges for households were as great. And they will play what part they can. You have to remember, of course, that supermarkets typically make only about 3% profit. So, even if they invested, say, half of their potential profits in this kind of activity, it's only going to make a small dent, but an important dent, I would suggest, on the challenges of nearly 10% inflation that you've just been discussing.
But I suppose a question that will occur to many people is whether this is really supermarkets business. And let me put it this way. The big shareholders in most British supermarket chains are also, for example, pension funds, and they expect a return. Is it really right for supermarkets to be doing a job that really is for the social services and endangering the returns for pensioners?
Well, I said they're playing their part. And of course, what they're really doing is competing. They're fighting for customers. When times are challenging, customers do shop around a bit more. So if you wanted to be cynical, of course, you could say that these are just marketing activities aimed at capturing new customers. So I don't see any kind of logical disconnect, if you like, between this kind of activity and supermarkets doing the right thing for their shareholders too. Of course, only 2 of our supermarkets are now publicly listed companies, the big ones anyway, Sainsbury's and Tesco. Others are privately held or held by big worldwide chains. I frankly don't think you should worry too much. I don't think customers should worry too much about shareholders being looked after. That's the job of management, along with making sure they do a great job for customers, because in the long run, the right thing for shareholders is doing the right thing for customers.
OK, well, I suppose I read earlier this week that Waitrose has its thermal underwear flying off the shelves. And I suppose some people might wonder whether the real answer here is for supermarkets to be pricing their normal goods even more competitively, because that will help a wider range of people, rather than what to some people might look like a bit of a gimmick?
Well, as I said, you know, the cynical might say it's just a marketing activity, but it doesn't mean it's a bad thing to do. Yes, of course, across the piece, they'll need to keep their prices sharp. If you're not competitive on price at the moment, and more customers are focusing on price, then you're going to be in trouble competitively. So I think they'll be doing that too. But as I said that earlier, you know, they haven't got massive profit percentages. They can make a dent in the inflation that customers will experience on their grocery shop. And you mentioned Waitrose and Thermals, that'll be in John Lewis. And of course, Marks and Spencer has a big clothing business too. Keeping clothes competitive, particularly those we use to wrap up warm as we enter winter, that'll be part of the competition too.
Is there a danger here, though? I mean, this all sounds, whether it's marketing gimmick or not, it's going to benefit some people. I don't think anybody will object to that. But there is a danger that what's happening here is that the government gets let off the hook because next week a minister will come in here and say to Sophy, honestly, you know, don't expect us to do too much. And everybody's pitching in. Look at what the supermarket's doing. They're helping.
Well, have a chat with Sophy and tell her not to let them off that hook. Obviously, everyone should play their part, and supermarkets will do, because it's a competitive market. But you've spent most of this programme discussing, one way or another, what difference the government can make. We've seen on energy prices a very significant and costly support package. But we should remember every single pound the government spends is our money still. We'll have to pay it back through taxes, or perhaps more likely our children and grandchildren paying it back through taxes. So I don't think either we should be overly blasé about the amount of money the government's spending. You know, personally, I think it should be more targeted and less blanket. I think those of us that can afford, and I'm very fortunate to be one of those people, to pay my bills for the energy, even at these high levels, I think we should pay our full bills, and that would leave more money for the most needy. And I personally believe much government activity would be better if it were targeted.
Does that mean, you've been in charge of some of the biggest enterprises in this country with millions of consumers and so on, so you do follow their behaviours pretty closely. From that point of view, do you think that what the Chancellor did and the way he approached the issue of dealing with cost of living was essentially the wrong approach? From what you've just said about targeting, it suggests that you think that they could have done better.
Well, look, I think we now officially call it a mini budget, was argued to be necessary because the issues it addressed were urgent. And some of those issues, fuel prices for winter, were clearly urgent, but others of the issues, some of the tax changes you've been discussing, were not urgent. And I think that, as much as anything, is what spooked the markets, with the consequences that it's going to have for people's household budgets with inflation and interest rates, of course. But yes, as a general rule, I don't think the government should be giving money to those people who can afford to pay their bills, so it can give more money to those who are going to struggle. I think targeting is perfectly possible, initially through the benefit system, but through some kinds of means testing. And I also think there should be a limit to the help the government provides. Long before this cost of living crisis arrived, we were discussing the carbon crisis, and higher energy prices, higher fuel prices, were all driving our cars less because of how expensive petrol and diesel is. That's a good thing if you take the long view. It may be painful to household budgets in the short term, but we have to have a different relationship with energy, we as a society. So I would not provide an unlimited support. I would make sure that everyone's able to keep themselves warm and fed, but ultimately we have to pay a higher price for energy going forward.
Admirably clear as always, Justin. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. It's been fun to be back, if only for one morning. After the break, we'll run through today's interviews and see what we've learned. And I'll be joined by our political correspondent, Rob Powell, for The Take. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. Stay with us.